Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where any combination of Dr. Ross, Christian, and Brian hosts national experts who share winning ideas to manage money in the home as a team. Join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every couple of weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. This week, we are honored to welcome Dr. Michelle Kruger, CFP, who holds a PhD in financial planning, housing, and consumer economics. Her dissertation focused on financial satisfaction and the joint financial management of couples. Dr. Kruger is also the author of The Psychology of Financial Planning, Practitioner Resource Guide, as well as other articles and case studies for certified financial planner practitioners. She is currently a senior financial planner at Gratis Capital, as well as a part-time lecturer at the University of Georgia and Modern Husbands Advisory Board member. For today's show, we're going to discuss how couples can agree about how they spend money. Dr. Kruger, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you guys about some of my experiences.
Well, speaking of those experiences, which are vast and very impressive, as I'm sure our listeners can attest to after hearing the introduction, how do you take those experiences, and in particular your doctorate, your educational background, and apply them to supporting married couples in your practice at Gratis Capital?
Absolutely. So I've been really lucky that I was at an educational institution like the University of Georgia that provided a lot of service learning and sort of, actionable learning. And so while I was at UGA, had the opportunity to work at the Aspire Clinic. Actually, I think Dr. Ross and I did a few sessions together back in the day.
We did a couple co-counseling sessions. Yeah.
A couple of research projects too. It was a lot of fun. So that really gave me the opportunity and the experience to kind of broaden my mind to what financial planning could be. So in that type of setting, we were working in an interdisciplinary setting. And so it really was sort of challenging in that in my classroom, I was learning about, taxes and retirement and budgeting and all of those types of things. And it was very clear cut for the most part. It was, this is good, this is bad. And so being in a scenario like the Aspire Clinic, and then also being exposed to other disciplines where they're doing really challenging things, having really challenging conversations, I think gave me the opportunity to really expand how I thought about financial planning and the types of conversations that we could have with clients and especially couples. I became aware very quickly in those counseling sessions how much easier it was to have a session with an individual as opposed to a couple. Things just got so much more interesting if there was a second person in the room and you had to kind of navigate those dynamics where it's two different people, potentially two different sets of goals, all of the things that come along with that. And then it's not just your relationship with one client, right, that you're navigating. It's your relationship with two clients and then potentially their relationship with each other too. So I think those types of experiences at, pretty early stage in my career made me pretty open to having challenging conversations with clients. I want to ask those challenging questions. I want to get into, questions like, are we in agreement on things? Really incorporating both partners equally. I really do not like client meetings where only one client is speaking. And I can tell that the other person is really disengaged and I'm not convinced that they're really an active part of this process. So those are just, I think, some of the ways that those types of experiences have really shaped how I do financial planning and how I meet with clients.
And I want to highlight one thing that you pointed out there that hopefully our listeners caught on to, and that's the importance of meeting with your financial planner together for both of you to be there because of the host of dynamics that are now introduced that have to be worked out anyway, right? Like you might as well work through those with somebody who is a professional in the room as opposed to trying to play the game of telephone where you met with your financial planner and then you go home and then you try to have this conversation with your spouse who either is disinterested or they don't understand it or they disagree, and all of which are going to lead to future challenges, right?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you highlighted that. It truly, I think it's very common. It's so common that we just have one client come to a meeting, or we have one client who, just comes into the meeting with the expectation that they're just going to sit there and listen, or that they're there because their partner asked them to be there, and it's so important to me to really have both partners engage in that process. And I really think it leads to much better outcomes for everybody.
You really need to just highlight everyone's voice in the room. You have to know where they're coming from, what their beliefs, what their values are, in order to make a proper financial plan for your clients.
Absolutely. And then too, an actionable financial plan, and then one that has a high probability of being implemented. And I think sometimes as a financial planner myself, and then when I speak with colleagues too, oftentimes we can be shocked that a client hasn't implemented financial advice, right? Why I told them what to do. I gave them this recommendation. I told them about all the tax benefits of doing this, or whatever the rationale might be. And then, a year later, we look back and we're confused, and we feel okay because we're like, well, we did our job. We gave the financial advice. But for me, it's so important to really think about the bigger picture and think about the outcomes. And I think having these types of conversations, exploring people's goals and their values and their biases and the relationship and everything that they're coming into that relationship, the planning relationship with, or the meeting with, is really what's going to give the context, and help to also connect the recommendations to the goals and the outcomes of the client, because I think that's a really important piece for encouraging implementation.
Absolutely. Well, let's actually dive into that a little bit. I mean, given your experience, given your expertise and all the work that you do, we wanted to do something a little bit different than some of our other podcasts because of who you are and what you do. So we're going to go and work through some of the questions that you actually pose to couples that, and as we work through these questions, we want you to share the purpose of those questions, some of the challenges you see and face with couples as you pose those, and then how you work actually through them. So
Absolutely.
Let's start with the first one, I guess, is what are our long-term goals as a couple and as a household?
Yeah. So some of these questions I have the opportunity to ask in every single client meeting. And I think this is one of those questions that really needs to be addressed anytime we're starting a financial planning engagement. But also some of the questions I think are truly for anybody listening who's trying to figure this out for themselves, trying to figure out, am I happy with how my money is being managed? Is this a system that's working for me? Or maybe they think, I'm not 100% happy. What can I potentially do to move forward and become, just move in a more positive direction with how we're managing money? And so these questions, I think, are really helpful for anybody to ask themselves about managing their money. And so for two people coming together, I rarely think this is a conversation that would be very beneficial to have with a financial planner. But even if they don't have a financial planner, I think coming together and asking the question, what are our long-term goals as a couple and as a household, and are they in alignment, right? Because it's a pretty easy question to ask as a financial planner. I think probably everybody comes into a financial planning engagement thinking that goals are going to be part of the discussion. But I really like this question because I think it also highlights the congruence piece, right? It's asking about our questions. It's not, partner one, what's your goal? And partner two, what's your goal? Now, if we need to start there, we can, and then hopefully move forward and kind of figure out the middle ground. But ideally, I think posing the question as a joint question and kind of seeing what each person comes up with individually And I really, when I pose this question to clients, it's important for me, again, to hear from both people. So even if the first person kind of gives a complete answer and the other person's nodding along, I'd want to ask a follow-up question, at least to say, partner two, do you feel the same way? Is there anything that you would add? Are you looking at this differently at all? And probably, if they're just kind of give a nod, I'd probably push back a little bit and really hopefully have them examine how they're feeling about that. But it's just, I think, a soft entry, getting the conversation started. I think typically it doesn't feel super overwhelming as a place to start. It's just, what are our goals? Where do we want to go? What are the things that we want to accomplish? And as a financial planner, I think how that question is approached gives me a lot of information too. That piece I really, really like. It tells me sometimes how they're communicating with each other, kind of the mental place they're coming into the conversation with too, right? If it's a short, brief answer, maybe they haven't really fully thought out. This is they're a little bit uncomfortable, brand new type of experience for them. Or maybe I get, a 5-10 minute answer just kind of from everything start to finish. And often I appreciate that because it gives me a lot of information to work with. But just, I think how the client starts that conversation, responds to that type of question gives me a lot of information.
And I do love this question too, because you start out with it just so generalized of what are your goals. It's not just specific, what are your financial goals?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is something I know, like we both kind of learned at UGA as well. It's just like all our financial goals are life goals. All our life goals are financial goals. Like it's just, what are your goals as a couple? And it's going to then play out to help create a financial plan to get you there.
I bet there's a trend here too. I think that's going to carry forward into our next set of questions. So the next question that you're asking your clients is, do we agree on how we spend our money? Spending, what's the purpose there?
Absolutely. So this actually came out of my dissertation research. And so a little bit of backstory. I finished my dissertation in 2019, really started that research in 2018. But that was actually at the exact same time that I was, really marriage was sort of the next step. Like I knew that was coming. And I also felt a little bit of pressure having the financial knowledge and the interest that I have to figure out a system for us to manage our money well. And so when I was looking at dissertation topics, I was thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if I could answer the question, how should every couple manage their money? Right? Wouldn't that be amazing? Unfortunately, that is not, the topic of today's conversation, because I think over the course of the research project really figured out there's so many different ways to do it, and how it works for every couple is going to be different. I don't think there's really a clear way that we as financial planners or really any other type of practitioner could say, this is exactly how you should do it. I prescribe to you this money management method. I think really what it comes down to ultimately is communication, and communicating through any types of differences that you have. But ultimately, as I was exploring those types of research questions, I got access to a data set that was really, really interesting. And as I was going through the questions in the data set, I noticed two questions in particular. And one of them was, how do you and your partner agree on how you spend money? And then the second question was, do you and your partner agree on how you save money? And at the time, this may not be mind-blowing to anybody else, but to me, it really was, that those two questions had been separated out and that they were two separate constructs. To me, sort of money management and how you agree at the time, to me, it just felt like it was all one thing that, you either agreed or you didn't. And like maybe there were some separate aspects, but, really dividing those out into two separate things. And ultimately, it was interesting because our findings about those two things were a little bit different too. And so that's something that I've really carried into my practice and into my work with clients, is that agreement on spending and agreement on saving are two completely separate conversations that we need to have.
Can you give an example?
What do you mean?
So they're two very different things, and I can see how somebody would just say, let's lump them all together. How is it that those two conversations are significantly different from one another?
Absolutely. So as we were thinking about this from a research context, and then I think my experience in practice has kind of backed up our hypotheses a little bit. But I think the difference between the agreement on the spending and the agreement on saving is really that the spending is a today thing. And even if you're potentially budgeting, right, it's a this month thing. It is much more, this is going to impact me. This is, I saw you swipe your credit card and I'm not happy about that. Or because, we're taking this vacation, I'm really stressed about how we're going to make our car payment. Like those types of conversations come up like every day in the moment, heat of the moment. And I think too, how people can react to those types of conversations in the moment can be very different than when you're having a conversation like, do you agree on saving? Which typically those types of conversations might happen in a financial planner's office.
Yeah.
Or it might happen when you're thinking about the future. Maybe you and your spouse are sitting down and you're making a plan, and it's probably in a more sort of measured, level-headed, like we probably knew this conversation was coming. I've been guilty of occasionally just calling my husband and saying, hey, I'm putting this down for how much you're saving for your 401k, but probably most people are not having, their retirement savings conversations the same way that we are.
But your husband's a lucky guy.
Yeah. He is. Yeah. I think we could probably do a whole other podcast episode just on kind of how we manage our money, and kind of his history and background and thoughts with money, because it's fascinating. He'll be the first person to tell you that he married me because partially, just for the record, because I took a lot of stress off of him with being able to deal with the money management. And he thinks that I married him because I find him to be a fascinating case study.
Aren't all three of us fascinating case studies as well for our partners?
We're what you call in the real estate world fixer-uppers,
I feel. So what just occurred to me that I want to make sure that we point out to the listeners is that the difference between saving for the future and spending choices now kind of falls into an abundance of research that talks about the challenges of being able to delay gratification or employ willpower to make financial decisions in the moment, right? So Dr. Mishkel talks about this in the marshmallow experiment, where when there's something that is hot, it's right in front of you, that it's really much more difficult to be able to restrain yourself to get what you want. Whereas if it's cold, if it's something that is not right in front of you, if it's in the future, it's a lot easier for you to employ restraint. It's certainly less emotional. So I so understand how talking about long-term financial goals is easier for financial planners, and it probably is, I'm assuming, something that couples agree on more frequently than the friction of spending choices in the moment where maybe things are tight. Maybe you're just trying to get by, and as a result, emotion really kicks in. Is that the case?
Anecdotally, in practice, I really think that that's the case. I haven't done the research to back it up, unfortunately. For me, the most interesting finding from that research that we did was really how much more important agreeing on spending was than agreeing on saving as it relates to current financial satisfaction. Right. And so I really think it'd be so fun to look at the frequency. I don't think that's been done yet of, do couples agree more frequently on saving and spending in different contexts? And then some of the other outcomes that might be associated with that. I was looking really at financial satisfaction, but I think marital satisfaction would be very interesting to see if there's implications there. And I think truly just from a practitioner standpoint, I think too, looking at it sort of forward looking, because again, the savings and the spending have such different present and future implications. I think it would be very, very interesting to think about, maybe today we're happy and we're doing the things that we want to, but do I sort of dread retirement because we aren't agreeing on saving? Or because I feel like we're overspending right now. But we see the opposite too in practice. We see a lot of overspending, but we see a lot of oversaving. And that can be really interesting in practice too, because then the conversation kind of flips to the other side where it's, don't miss out on the experiences today that could potentially be really important. Don't miss out on the memories that you could be making and the relationships that you could be building. Because you're saving more than you should be.
That's finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
My balance is my wife for that. I'm an oversaver, and she's not an overspender. She's very frugal. But we had a past guest on who's an expert in financial trauma, and he shared that a lot of our money stories originate from when we were around 7 or 8 years old. And that a lot of our choices and who we are can be traced back to those ages in our childhood. And that occurred to me that I was in a tornado at that time. Like 1 second, I'm watching different strokes. The next second, there's nothing. There's literally one wall that's left. And my mom was badly injured. Like kind of our life was turned upside down. So I think for me, I see just money as a security blanket, as an opportunity to make sure that everybody around me is safe if we have enough saved. And of course, my father was crazy frugal too. But I think that that's probably trauma. And that as a result of that, I need somebody that can help me balance it out and have a rational conversation like you just did, explaining that we should have experiences now and take time to live in the moment. And I'm sure listeners out there can identify with both of those types of circumstances.
Oh, absolutely. And the other thing I want to highlight too is, as somebody who has probably a greater than average amount of financial knowledge and a greater than average financial experience, I do not have this figured out in any way, shape, or form. I might have some additional tools to tackle these types of things and these types of conversations. But I think for anybody listening, it is such a process to figure out what is going to work. And also to try different things, right? It's okay to try something new. And if it doesn't work, to just recognize, okay, this isn't really working. Can we try something else? I think just being open-minded and also being kind to yourself as you're tackling these types of really challenging situations and challenging conversations. It's not that you've never had, a money class and you don't feel like you know very much about money. That doesn't stop you from having a money conversation or trying to manage your money in the way that works best for you. So, I definitely don't want clients or anybody that I might work with, just, because I think too, that can preclude good conversations, because then they think we're coming to the conversation from a place of judgment. And that is not the case. I'll be the first person to tell you that I do not have everything figured out. Have a lot of things to work on, financially, relationally, all of that. I think it's just for clients and people to come to those conversations from a place of authenticity and wherever they might be in that moment.
Well, that definitely just speaks to the difficulty and the effort that's needed to be put into it when, we have experts that are still human, right? And I mean, and I know the three of us talk about this, like these kind of things every week, and we're still learning, we're still struggling, we still have to put in the effort.
Oh, I thought, Bruce, that we three agreed that we had it entirely figured
out. Yeah, right.
A quick word from one of our sponsors, Money Marriage You. Listeners have told us that they love the ideas we share on our podcast to manage money as a team and want to learn more. That is why we created Money Marriage You, self-paced online courses for couples designed by national financial therapy and financial planning experts. You can find our Money Marriage You courses on our website at modernhusbands.com. While visiting modernhusbands.com, be sure to join fellow Modern Husbands as bi-monthly newsletter subscribers and receive great ideas to manage money in the home as a team and a few free gifts. Now back to the show.
Well, I'm excited about this next question that you ask. Do we align in our willingness and comfort level when it comes to taking risk? So what's your purpose and your intentions in asking that question?
Absolutely. So I had the opportunity to do a lot of risk tolerance research in grad school, and I loved it. I found it fascinating. I worked a lot with John Grable, who really has published and done so much research when it comes to risk tolerance. And it's also one of those topics that I find is so practical when it comes to being a financial planner and when it comes to making decisions. I think it's just an interesting framework when I think about almost any decision that I could make financially. There's some degree of risk, right? It might be, am I going to pay off my credit card bill this month? No risk, right? Like there would be risk if I didn't pay it off. So to me, that type of thing is a no-brainer. But also it frames decisions like, am I going to stay at my current job, or am I going to go take a new job, or am I going to start a business, right? If I'm thinking about the risk that's involved in those types of decisions and recognizing that one partner might be incredibly supportive, incredibly trusting of their partner, but also feel a great degree of stress because of the risk that those types of decisions can bring to a household, right? New business may or may not work out. New job may or may not work out. Might require a pay cut, might be a big increase in pay, but it's a commission-based job. And so our income security has changed. And so I think understanding, again, it's if you're asking it in a scenario where it's sort of measured and we're already kind of talking about these types of things, I think it takes some of the stress out of a conversation of like, are we going to take a job? Or are we not going to take a job? If we're understanding our partners and how they feel about risk coming into any type of financial conversation, I think that gives a lot of information about how they might react and how they might be feeling as we're having different types of money conversations. And so I think in a way, I'm really lucky that risk tolerance was such a big part of my graduate education because it has been so applicable. You know, obviously investment management, portfolio allocation is probably the most widely used application in financial planning of risk tolerance. A lot of people or financial planners will ask their clients to take a risk tolerance assessment to figure out, you know, how do we manage their investments and how do we create a portfolio allocation for them. But I think it really, in my opinion, plays into every financial decision that somebody can make when it comes to, you know, are we comfortable with spending a lot of our money and saving less, or maybe we want to save a lot because we have a very low tolerance. So that has been, for me, very useful if I can understand a client's risk tolerance very early on in the relationship. That gives me a lot of information for potentially their behaviors that I might see later on, or how I can best frame conversations to have with them. But I think too, in a partner's relationship setting, I really think it's probably an underutilized question when it comes to having financial conversations.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever talked about money, spending decisions, saving decisions, investing decisions, debt decisions with my wife in the context of risk management before. I know we like to share a lot of like tips and tricks, but that's going to be the tips and tricks portion that I take away and go try to apply. Thank you.
I love that. Yeah. I hope you let me know how that goes.
I will. Dr. Kruger, I have your email now, so.
It's such a really good perspective, like talking about that risk comfort level, because you're right. Like most people, I've definitely talked about it with our investments and like the asset allocation, but not in the context of like, should I change this job? Should I go back to school? Like we've had conversations about that, but not in the context of our risk tolerance.
This could have been really helpful to me, years ago, at me and Chelsea years ago, when thinking about, wedding plans and, what we're comfortable spending there in the context of, risk, especially an opportunity cost of, spending on one, big ticket thing versus another.
Right.
This kind of like lowering of the temperature and bringing it back down to risk tolerance and sort of a more, it's almost clinical in the way that, we're kind of describing this decision making. But that can help, lower the temperature in some of these conversations that are liable to, be contentious because we have different risk tolerances, between the two partners in a relationship.
Absolutely. And I really try to normalize with people how common it is for people to have different risk tolerances in relationships. I feel like in practice, when I'm working with couples, I see differences in risk tolerance more frequently than I see very close alignment. And so that's why I think just calling it out, having conversation about it, letting everybody speak about it is very, very helpful. And then what I found too, because my husband and I, we do have very similar risk tolerances. We're on the lower end, but for me, I have more financial knowledge, and I found that financial education and financial knowledge can have a huge impact when somebody has a low inherent risk tolerance. Because when you have more information, something sometimes feels safer. So for me, having seen hundreds or thousands of different Monte Carlo simulations in my life and understanding the danger, the longevity risk, the danger of potentially outliving my assets, and what it looks like if I was to leave all of my assets in cash, that causes me 100 times more fear than volatility in the financial markets, because I also have enough information to understand how markets have performed over time and to understand that market volatility is to be expected. And so with my clients, when there's differences in risk tolerance, I find that financial education and kind of talking through those things can remove some of the stress and can remove some of the fear, and can be effective too. Because also when you have a client that has too high of a risk tolerance and is kind of really comfortable, making leaps or making big changes without necessarily thinking it through, I think taking the exact same approach can help them take a little bit more of a measured approach in their decision making.
The last question that you pose to clients is, who's responsible for day-to-day management of household finances and planning for the future? Is it one person? Is it a joint activity? And crucially, are we both in agreement about, who, or if it's both of us, are we both in agreement on that?
And so this is one where I really wish I could get into this more with clients than I often can, because I think it is such an important question. And so with this one too, I'd really encourage anybody who is taking a look at their financial management and how they're doing it in their relationship to really sit down and ask themselves and then their partner this type of question. day-to-day household management, I think very pressing for a lot of different people. Could be a joint activity, could be a separate activity. Couples, I think there's a lot of research, and some of the research that we did in my dissertation did suggest that couples who combined their finances fully were happier or with their finances and with their financial satisfaction than couples who didn't. But I definitely do not think that joint financial management is right for everybody, right? That is not the takeaway that I want anybody to take away from this conversation. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. The most important thing is going to be, have we developed an intentional system? And are we both really, really happy with how that system is in place? And if one of us is not really happy with the system that is in place, is it temporary, right? Is it just, I'm taking on a little bit more of the financial management right now because I have a partner who is in school, or I have a partner with a really demanding job, and I'm going to take this off of their plate for now. But we have something in place where we know this is temporary. It's not going to be forever. This is not the long-term plan. We both agree that this is not how we want to do things long-term. And for right now, just kind of as a Band-Aid, we're going to make it through this really intense time in our lives. We're going to do things this way.
Quick clarifying question. So you have joint financial management. I just want to make sure I understand how you're defining this. Joint financial management, are you defining that as both of you have a role in the action of managing the money? So not controlling money. Controlling money is sitting down, deciding what your goals are and those kinds of things. But the actual day-to-day management, is that how you're defining joint financial management?
Yes, for the purposes of this conversation, that is exactly, because I think I appreciate you asking that question, because I think there is so many different ways that it could be handled.
Yeah.
And so I think too, also day-to-day financial decisions and things like that is not necessarily the same as like, are we combining our finances, right? Is every single account joint?
Right.
And everything like that. And for me, that joint financial management, for the purposes of this conversation, would be, every single account is a joint account except retirement accounts. And then, the spouse is the primary beneficiary and all that kind of stuff. But then also, when financial decisions are made, there's at least an effort for it to be a joint decision, right? And so that might be, so I'll use myself as an example. I make a lot of the day-to-day decisions just because my partner has a lot of he has many negative memories around money, and there's really just, if there's going to be a money conversation, it is, in his mind, it is going to be a negative thing. It is something to dread. It brings him the opposite of joy anytime a money is spoken about, even. And so for me, joint financial management is, of course, everything is jointly titled, that can be titled, and primary beneficiaries and all that stuff. But if something needs to be dealt with, there is a communication that takes place, even if it's just, hey, big month, birthday, had to transfer some money from savings just to make sure that we paid for that, even though before we spent that money, we had talked about it and we'd agreed about, this was something that felt worth it. But just so like, I went ahead and took care of this, right? Or it might be, hey, I ran some projections. Will you look at them with me? Here's what I saw. Like, are you comfortable with this? Like, do you have any questions about this? Is there anything else that like we could take a look at together? And so even in a situation like that, it's, I think, trying to be really intentional in communication as much as possible, and making sure there's an opportunity for input at every step of the process, so that both of us feel like we were able to contribute to the decision, even if what happens a lot of the times is he's like, I trust you. I might feel like this fear that I'd like to talk about, but ultimately I really trust your judgment. So
Is there one piece of, or can you give us like one piece of actionable and simple advice that our listeners can use in their daily lives moving forward?
Absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind there is just start the conversation. Right? It's almost like one of those things where it's like the Nike slogan, right? Just do it. Like it makes it sound so easy. And it's like, this isn't easy. This is a very this is a lifestyle thing that you're trying to get me to do with like a 3-word simple slogan. But it's truly, if this feels overwhelming, just sit down and ask one of these questions, right? And maybe you don't have to ask all 5 at the same time. It doesn't have to be a huge deal. You might get a couple sentences of response and you can kind of mull on that and digest it, and then maybe come back to the conversation later. But I think when you think about personal finances or even financial planning, it has the potential to be this overwhelming thing because some of these topics are really complex. And then you add in the feelings piece of it and the stress piece of it, and then the day-to-day, obligations that you have. And it's like, when on earth are we going to sit down and like tackle this massive thing? And especially if you've been in this relationship a long time and it's been one of those elephants in the room that has been causing you stress, it becomes one of those things that it's just like, how do you even like begin to overcome that and take the next steps? And so I really like, it could be casual. Like you could be, I think, well, my husband's used to this. Like I'll just, when he's brushing his teeth, like I'll ask him, how are you feeling about money today? Or like last night it was, do you have any positive money memories? Because like I was kind of thinking about our conversation today. And so he's kind of unfazed by me asking those types of questions at this point. But I think even just starting with, you're having coffee in the morning, and you could say, something I've been thinking about is I'm not really sure if we have the same long-term goals. What do you think our long-term goals are? Where do you think we're going? And just kind of starting the conversation from that perspective, I think can be very telling, give you information, and hopefully it feels like a low stakes way to just make a little bit of progress. And then again, the financial planner in me has to say it. It's one of those like long-term compound growth things where if you just do a little bit over time, you'll be shocked at the results that you have if you just are persistent and do a little bit habitually. I really think if you have these conversations and just ask a question or two, once a month, and just start the process of working towards something that makes you happier, makes your partner happier, feels more cohesive.
Dr. Kruger, if our listeners want to reach out to you or follow you, how can they do so?
I am not on as much social media as I should be. I'm working on it. Right now, I am primarily just keeping up with people through LinkedIn. So they can search for me on LinkedIn. I love connecting with people, and I try to, as I'm involved with new research or find things that are interesting, I really like to put things out on that platform. But welcome to reach out to me via LinkedIn. And I think my email is just mkruger@gratiscapital.com if anyone's interested in reaching out and, having conversation and talking about these things.
Well, we thank you for today's conversation, Dr. Kruger.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow Modern Husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.